IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. We at the Takshashila Institution have recently published a new edited volume based on our flagship New World Order project, which aims to understand how our world is going to be changing over the next 25 years and what India needs to do about it. This book is called India's Marathon, Reshaping the Post-Pandemic World Order. As of the release of this podcast, you should be able to buy India's Marathon on Amazon and read together this fascinating collection of essays that we've brought together by a host of leading public intellectuals, experts, and practitioners to create a comprehensive vision of the future centered on India and for India watchers across the world. We really have a diverse selection of authors and topics in India's Marathon. I was one of the co-editors, so I'm really excited to be hosting this podcast today with one of the authors who contributed to India's Marathon and one of the brightest minds talking and writing about India's judiciary and legal system today, Alok Prasanna Kumar. Welcome, Alok.
Thanks, Anirudh. That's a very generous description of me, and I'm delighted to be on the podcast.
I'm sure that my listeners will agree once they've actually read your chapter. But speaking of your chapter, let's get straight to it, right? So, like, your chapter is about how India needs to reform its institutions to cope with the challenges that a changing world is going to offer, and you dive into a great deal of detail on how the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary are really not doing their jobs the way that they were originally intended to do. And you have some really interesting ideas on what needs to be done to solve that. So, of course, over the course of this podcast, we won't get into too much detail as to what your solutions are, because, of course, I'd like our listeners to actually go out and buy a book. But let's begin by actually talking about the issues that India faces. Now, on paper, at least, India is the world's largest democracy. It's been conducting ostensibly free and fair elections for many decades. But as you put it, even as India's legislatures and democracy seem to deepen, they seem to be getting more and more ineffectual. So what exactly do you mean by that? Why is it that you don't see the debates and votes of Indian parliamentary, issues in Indian parliament or Indian state assemblies making the news the way that issues in, let's say, the US Congress or Senate tend to make the news? Why are they not as important, it seems, to the policy process?
So you mentioned the US, Anirudh, and those of you who have followed the news to some extent will remember that the Trump administration tried repeatedly and failed to repeal what they call the Obamacare Act, or the American Health Care Act. The reason why, and would not make sense to a lot of people, because the Republican Party, which had campaigned on this, Trump, who had campaigned on this, they had a majority in the House of Representatives, at least till 2018. They had a majority. They continued to have a majority in the Senate, and of course, the presidency was in their control. So why were they not able to repeal it? They weren't able to repeal it because a certain number of Republican senators who said that, no, this goes against the interests of my constituents. I know I will not be able to win re-election. I know I will be betraying their trust because they have told me how much this law helps them. I helped pass this law and I don't want to repeal it. Such a situation is unthinkable in India. In India today, there is no chance of a BJP MP in the central government, or say a Congress MLA in Rajasthan or Chhattisgarh, or even a TRS MLA in Telangana standing up to their party and saying that I don't think this is the right course of action in this legislation. I don't want to vote for it. Or conversely, in a less conflicting way, to say that I have problems with this legislation. Please take my views and concerns on board and make these changes before we pass this legislation. And the reason for that, very simply, is because of the 10th schedule. The anti-defection law, which was supposed to check defection, defines it so broadly that anybody who votes against the party's whip Again, I'm not talking about really small legislation. The the Obamacare law in the US was a big issue, and definitely they would have issued a whip. So any big legislation here in India also, that is, like, can a MLA take an independent stand? No, they can't. They will be hit by the anti-defection law, and it will be assumed, it will be deemed that they have given up membership of their political party, and therefore they have given up membership of the House. Therefore, they have to essentially give up being an MLA, go back to their constituency, fight an election, and come back into the House. So this effectively deters any member of the Legislative Assembly, or for that matter, a parliament, from taking a principled position on this. Now, if there is no way for you to take a principled position on legislations being passed by your party, then you just go along. If you're just going to go along and vote based on in the house of in the chamber of the house, as in how your party as in how when your party requires you to, of what great skills are your debating use. You might as well just be a spokesperson for the party's line. You just stand up in the house and repeat the lines that your party has told you. It looks like a quote unquote a debate, and everybody just votes exactly as they're expected to. Now, if you're just a decent spokesperson, then the skills to be a parliamentarian, where you're somebody who can bring out the goods and bads of the law, somebody who can stand up and protect the interests of their constituents, somebody who has an idea of how government works and how it should change, those become irrelevant. You're just an empty seat, a straw person who just needs to press the button when they're told to, turn up when they're told to, do what they're told to, and you go back. Your representation really doesn't seem to matter that much. Your representation matters. You essentially become a grievance redressal cell for the ruling party. When you collect complaints, go to a bureaucrat and say, please solve these complaints, and that's about it. Or you're constantly on call saying, please arrange X number of buses to ensure that some people go from here to there. You don't really have any space or any opportunity to function as a legislator. You don't have any time to do the research, right? You don't have any opportunity or any reward for even doing it. If today you are a legislator who actually takes time out to read, research, and respond to legislation, nobody cares. Because yes, somebody will talk about it on social media, somebody may write about it, but it will not make an impact on the final draft of the legislation, because if the government wants it a certain way, the government will have its way. So what we have done over the last 40 years is reduced our legislatures to essentially just voting houses. You just come in, you vote, and you go away. Nothing that you say or do has a major impact on the law, and that has been the pattern. It used to matter when there were coalition governments. Let me just clarify that. But the absence of coalition governments is a recent phenomenon in the central government, but has been happening at the state level for quite some time. We've seen this pattern happen everywhere a state legislative assembly is dominated by one party, and inevitably it has now become the norm at the center also. I always say in India, good ideas or bad ideas always travel from state to center, never the other way around. And this is an example. And what we are seeing right now is an example of that. It has been in the making for 20 years, but we have reduced our legislatures to essentially just voting houses. There are two follow-on consequences of it. One, if you don't have any option to debate, you might as well make noise. It means that a lot of time of the legislature is lost in shouting, screaming, throwing papers, rushing to the well, etc., etc., etc. The second consequence is that for parties, you want to have someone whom you can control, someone who will not raise principled objections, someone who will not say, this may be good for the party, but it goes against my constituents. So you choose criminals. You choose criminals who are dependent on being in government to slow down their trials, to continue their activities, to continue to make a profit, and you're happy with that. You don't need them to raise interesting points. You just need them to function as a reasonably effective grievance redressal cell at the constituency level, and you sort of want them to turn up and do as they are told in the legislature. So the idea that our legislators should be independent, should exercise their own mind, and should work in the interest of their constituents has been dramatically affected by the 10th schedule. And I have proposed a solution for it. It doesn't mean just do away with the 10th schedule. Nobody is saying defection is a bad thing in this, is not a bad thing in this country. But I think there is a nuanced way of doing it. And in my book, I have explained what is the best way to restructure our anti-defection law for this purpose.
So this actually leads me to another question kind of connected to defections, Alok. And that is the role that speakers play in India, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners may recall that while Brexit was happening, for example, the British speaker, I don't exactly remember his name, I think it's out with a B, kind of became a meme on the internet for loudly screaming "order, order,"
Yes.
because the parliamentarians were being quite rowdy.
Yeah.
But in comparison to the stature that speakers have in parliamentary democracies like the UK, Indian speakers are rarely heard of for doing something on procedural grounds. They instead seem to be, as you put it, agents of the ruling party who dispense favorable rulings. And you only seem to hear of speakers when they've gone and disqualified the entire opposition on rather flimsy grounds or opened up some or the other seats for by-elections. So what's your take on that? How has the speaker come to become such a partisan figure?
I mean, you're talking about John Bercow, who's the speaker in the UK. He showed us what a good speaker is like. And I think he's somebody who, again, there will be two opinions on this, but the fact of somebody who asserts the dignity of the House rather than reflect the interests of the ruling party is what we want as a speaker. His position always, and I'm using specifically John Bercow's example, his position always is that something like Brexit has to go through House. Parliament can't, the government cannot just look to use its majority to push things through the House or demand that the House pass bills in a certain way to suit its agenda. And yes, they may have a parliamentary majority, but it is a meaningful parliamentary majority when you follow the rules of parliament. Coming to the Indian situation, if you look at how the constitution was before the 10th schedule, the speaker was possibly among the more powerless authorities, like say the President of India. The President of India has a lot of power to sign and do and all of that, but those are not like power to issue rules, guidelines. They cannot act in their own capacity, right? The speaker likewise had authority only within the four corners of the House, or whatever, the circle of the House in the Indian context of the Indian Parliament. Their authority didn't go outside. There was a limited scope for it in the context of contempt, and there is a very famous case. I'd urge readers to look up this instance where the speaker held judges of the speaker of the UP Assembly held two judges of the Allahabad High Court in contempt. And what happened afterwards is a fascinating episode. You should read about it in textbooks and other places. But I sort of want to talk about the fact that except for these very small instances, the speaker did not have that much power. The speaker's powers inside the House were just to make sure that there is order, there's decorum, signs on the dotted line, and ensure that the time of the House is spent usefully. What the 10th schedule did was to give the speaker the power to determine who forms government and who doesn't. And that has meant that they've become partisan. I'd like to draw an analogy over here. If you look at it constitutionally, the president and the governor are in pretty much the same position, right? They're both head of state. One is the head of state of the Union of India. The other is, say, the head of state of the state of Karnataka. There's mostly supposed to be figureheads. But there's a key difference. The governor has the power to send a report to the president to dismiss a state government. Now that has been limited, restricted, rules prescribed, whatever it is. But just this power that the governor has discretion to decide whether the state government should continue or not has meant that central government has always imposed partisan governors. We have had good presidents, we have had bad presidents. No one has acted in as execrable a manner as some of the governors that we are seeing today. Right? We saw the instance of Bhagat Singh Koshyari trying to create a majority on his own through Devendra Fadnavis and Ajit Pawar in the last year, approximately this time in Maharashtra. We see a governor in the context of West Bengal who is pretty much considering himself as the leader of the opposition and openly challenging the lawfully elected state government. We have governors who, when it is convenient for the central government, simply refusing to sign on bills legitimately passed by the state assembly. So the fact that you have given them this one power has meant that partisan governors end up getting appointed. Likewise, the fact that you've given speakers this crucial power to determine whether a government stands or falls has meant that partisan speakers have been appointed. You've essentially created that set of incentives which parties have acted upon. Now, I'm not saying anything brand new. For those of you who are interested, please look at this judgment of the Supreme Court of India called Quixoto Holojon versus Zakiliu. Don't worry about the exact spelling. Google is very smart. Just put in Quixoto Holojon versus Zakiliu. It's a judgment which upheld the 10th schedule by a narrow margin of 3:2. The dissenting judgment by Justice Verma is incredible. It's a short judgment. It is not very, very detailed, but it is a short judgment and it is almost prophetic. Justice J.S. Verma of the famous J.S. Verma Committee fame pretty much says this is what you have done. You have essentially turned a neutral, impartial authority who's only in charge of, like in cricket or in baseball, calling wides and sixes or whatever it is, into someone who can determine the outcome of the game, right? Like you have essentially turned a cricket umpire into a gymnastics referee, right? A gymnastics referee gives scores and decides who wins and who loses. Whereas in cricket, the umpire is just there to make sure that the rules are followed. That is the key difference that has happened. Justice J.S. Verma's dissenting opinion is brilliant in how presciently he predicts what will happen if the 10th schedule is allowed to be implemented as it is designed. And well, we are seeing that right from the start. There were these criticisms made, but political parties didn't think it was a very big deal. And some of the political parties which were in power when the 10th schedule was passed are now at the receiving end of it. And of course, by that, I mean the Congress. The Congress was in power when the 10th schedule was passed. And now they've been at the receiving end of how it is being used against some of the governments formed by them. So this is the source of the problem, to me, in my view, of why our legislatures have become this, essentially dysfunctional. Our legislators individually no longer function as legislators. They function largely as either grievance addressal cells for their constituencies or just simply spokespersons for their parties in the House. And that's about it. That's a very unfortunate state of affairs.
Alok, I have a very basic question, which is how much of this institutional degradation that you have talked about to do with the rules that we have put in place? How much of it has to do with behavior, with society, with culture?
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of it is in the rules. Because even if you go back 4 or 5 decades and read through some of the parliamentary discussions, I mean, not to say that it is like one sudden drop off like a cliff. You will find good parliamentary debates when it comes to the nuclear liability deal and so on and so forth. The quality of the legislators, the quality of the debates, I think have been reduced quite dramatically by the choice of who becomes, by the choice of parties as to who becomes legislators, and also by the rules that we have put in place. Now, I'll give you another example of this. And sorry, just to complete my thought, it has sort of created the incentives for parties to choose. And maybe our society has some relevance to this, but just keep in mind something like the Constituent Assembly debates, right? You had people both nominated and people who were elected. And if you just read through the debates, there is no way you can say this person was nominated and this person was selected. There's nothing inherently cultural or societal which makes someone like a bad debater or bad this thing and doesn't like. Of course, women participate much less. That we can purely attribute to a societal thing which sort of intimidated women who are a small minority in the House into not speaking that much. So this is why you will find certain aspects there. You can explain maybe why Dalit legislators aren't heard as much through some of this, but insofar as a systemic issue, I would say it has to do with the rules put in place. Speaking of Dalit legislators, the rules have had an impact in another way. Keep in mind that there was this choice actively made that there will be no separate electorates for Dalits, and instead there will be reserved seats. Now, the choice was on two ways in which Dalits would be represented. In the sense that with the present system that we have, parties which otherwise vie for votes of non-Dalits also put up a Dalit candidate and, in a reserved seat, and that person wins or loses. But that person hasn't won because the Dalit community has supported them. There are hardly any, I don't think there are any constituencies in this country where the proportion of Dalits in the constituency is more than 30% so that they can single-handedly determine who wins. There may be a few. It's hard to say until we know the details of the latest census. But broadly, because we have chosen the system, it means that the person who is winning from a Dalit reserved constituency does so on the strength of the non-Dalit votes, not so much of the Dalit votes. On the other hand, if there were separate electorates, right, if Dalits voted only for their representatives, you would have a body of legislators who would be dependent on Dalit votes and would have to defend their particular constituency in the context of other debates. Now, there was no understanding of how this would play out in a coalition era in the future, and we have seen how Dalit parties like the BSP or the VCK in the south, or the Dalit Panthers and the other parties in the Republican Party of India in Maharashtra played out. But the fact is that Dalit politics in India has been representative Dalit politics in India has been fundamentally affected by this particular choice of rules that we have chosen for how Dalits will be represented. No one is saying they shouldn't be represented. It's just a question of whether they should have reserved constituencies or separate electorates. So that is another example that I can give, where the choice of rules has had a dramatic impact on the way in which the legislators have functioned and the legislators have operated. And likewise, the 10th schedule, at least in my view, has sort of shaped how legislators function. I don't think there is something fundamentally inherently in Indian society to say that we prefer a criminal candidate to a non-criminal candidate. But the fact is, these are choices being made by political parties who choose whom to give a ticket to, who know that a person who comes with certain kinds of qualifications or quote-unquote qualifications is more suitable for a house which is designed to do X than somebody who's designed to do this. So, which is where I think, not to say that that's the only criteria. There are, of course, the factors that, fundraising has become more non-transparent. All of those go into existence. But I do think that we have to sort of say that it's the rules which have sort of prescribed how legislators and legislatures function, rather than something about the society itself.
That's a really interesting point, Alok. I had my working model of Indian democracy is that it's essentially rubber stamp feudalism, where you already have very deeply entrenched networks of patronage, which every 5 years go through the ritual of an election to only end up selecting broadly the same candidates again and again. And I'd always thought that that was a result of like a particular way that Indian society has been organized. And perhaps that is still a part of it. But your explanation that the rules that these legislators and more importantly, these political parties are operating in kind of help them get away with things that they might not have been able to get away with in a different kind of system.
Yeah.
So that's a fascinating point. Now, so the next big set of issues that you identified in your chapter were related to the executive, where you pointed out that the legacy of British administrative structures hasn't necessarily fully been gotten over yet. And there isn't, how do I put this? Local administrations are not as responsive to the needs of societies as they should be. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What are the shortcomings of the executive in India, and what are the causes of these shortcomings?
Let's keep in mind what we mean when we say British system. The British system was about incurring the least possible expenditure to gain the maximum possible revenue out of India. Whatever their rhetoric might have been about civilization, etc., 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 at the end of the day, starting with the East India Company and moving on to when the British government formally annexed India as a colony in 1858, the goal of the administration was, what is the least that we have to spend to extract the maximum from this country? It was an extractive kind of system of government. So they had, of course, they would do some measures of social reform because it suited them to keep the population reasonably satisfied. But the intent was never to have a deep and possibly, I think the term used is a thick state, right? A government which does a lot of things. They weren't that interested in a government which does a lot of things. They were interested in a government which does the bare minimum to ensure that there's enough revenue collected to profit, not just to justify the existence of the state, but to actually profit. So when we sort of think about how it has continued, we have to keep in mind that that underlying ideology may have changed, but the mechanics of it, how it functions, has not fundamentally changed. So which means that, some of our officials still carry the titles that they had in the British era, collector, right? Doesn't indicate you're a representative of the government, doesn't indicate that you're talking about a democratic republic. As a collector, your job seems to be to collect something. And what are you collecting? You're collecting land revenue. So focus of your effort. Today, you may do 10,000 other things as a collector, but just the fact that your title is this, reflects the colonial approach to it. Magistrate, right? As a magistrate, you're in charge of law and order, not so much good governance. There is a gap between the terms law and order and good governance. So when you're a magistrate, you're in charge of keeping the natives, quote unquote, peaceful and not worrying about constant breakdowns in law and order, because you need to ensure that the collector can do his job. So which is what I want to draw that links very specifically. And we haven't fundamentally changed the way that works. Very bright, very talented young people across the country with their hearts in the right place, with their best of intentions, enter the system. And I specifically am focusing on the IAS here every year to be part of the system, which takes them from the position of being a collector or a district magistrate somewhere in India, all the way to becoming like the topmost bureaucrat, which is the cabinet secretary or the principal secretary to the PMO in the country, and as the case may be. Now, to me, this feels like this is not how modern government is supposed to work, right? And we're talking about the permanent executive. Let me just clarify, the executive can be broadly split into the political executive, which is your ministers, your cabinet ministers, state ministers, and of course at the top of the PM or the CM, as the case may be. They're the political executive, they change every 5 years. But we have in India what is the permanent executive, right? The permanent executive are everyone from your IAS officers all the way down to the IRS and the various services who are appointed for a lifetime job, subject to them for violating the code of conduct or whatever it is. They have a permanent job of being in government and being the face of the government. Now, we expect too much of too few. The handful of people who constitute the permanent executive in India are required, in my view, to do 10 times the work of 10 men and women. Each person that is occupying a post in the IAS, I think, is being asked to do the work of 10 men and women, and not just physically. I'd say that you're asking them to do the work of an urban planner, of a tax policy expert, of a health expert, and you can literally think of any branch of government. And you will realize after a point of time that what they're specialized in is management, right? And you can be a good MBA and you can work in different companies, but there will be somebody who knows the business better than you. As an MBA, you're never in a position to say, you're never always in a position to say that I know better than the scientist developing my product. You won't know the science better than the guy developing a product. You won't know the law better than your general counsel. You won't know possibly the engineering better than the guy designing the civil and infrastructure. As an MBA, you're generally in charge of the management. If you have these skills, it's a bonus. So what we have is a generalist IAS, and there's nothing wrong with it, except that we're just asking them to do too many different things. We're asking them to do too many different things at various levels, which go against developing specialization. And how to address this is something that a lot of governments have been aware. Let me be clear about that. The government is aware that we don't have enough specialists and are trying to, fill that particular gap of how do we get in enough specialists into government. And various attempts have been made. They have not succeeded particularly well. And I suggest what might be the best way forward. But there is a second aspect of this issue. And the second aspect of this issue is even questioning what should be the role at which a generalist like an IAS officer enters. I don't think it should be at the level of the district magistrate or the collector. I think this is where you have to sort of, think about our third level of government. And I've gone into detail as to how that might be addressed. And I think we have to take our third level of government more seriously and not just treat them as some local bodies you have some elections for at some points of time. I think rethinking how the permanent executive functions is not just about ensuring the whole generalist versus specialist divide is properly filled, but also in how do we deepen India's democracy. Because as I said, these terms, these terms like district collector, district magistrate, they have a certain colonial context. And we need to think as to how to deepen our democracy by removing these sort of colonial leftovers from our bureaucratic system. Not to say that the individuals there are doing fundamentally wrong things. They're doing their best in the limited capacity that they have. But the way government is seen and functions at the lowest level is somehow affected by the way these posts are created and who mans them and at what point of time.
Fascinating. So, Alok, of course, you and I have already had a really long conversation about what ails the judiciary in India in 2020, which we'll link to in the description of this podcast, of course. So let's kind of like loop back and try to get a little bit of perspective overall on India's institutional health now. So we've talked quite extensively about the legislature. We've talked about the executive, but I get the feeling that today there's a whole lot of other things also going on in Indian society, in the media ecosystem, that seem to be influencing and feeding off of the rules and incentives that have already existed in the political ecosystem so far, right? So from a very high level, how do you see India's political economy at this point in time? Very broadly, over the next 25 years, do you think that even with all the issues that you've identified, when it comes to challenges like climate change, for example, do you think that we're ready to cope? And if not, what single reform would you think is absolutely necessary for us to undertake?
It depends on whether I'm being particularly optimistic or particularly pessimistic. And on odd days, I'm an optimist. These are on even days, I'm a pessimist. So we are recording this on an odd day, so I can be a bit of an optimist here. In all seriousness, though, I think we are looking at an optimistic and a pessimistic approach to it. The pessimistic approach would be to say that, look, there is no stomach for these kinds of deep-ranging reforms. The flaws are evident as we see them. There might be attempts to fix it, but we are going to struggle as a country and as a nation to address these problems. I think one area where we're going, in the last 8 months, given the pandemic and its impact on us, I think we have seen what the Indian state can and cannot do. I think we have truly seen the extent and the limit of the Indian state's powers. And it's not just in the context of whether X number of people died or Y number of people got COVID-19. But in terms of when the government set out to do something, did it know why it was doing it? Did it know what it hoped to achieve? Did it know how to achieve it? And did it have success in it? I think we have truly understood the capacity of the Indian government. And a lot of what I spoke about has gotten I wrote this piece much prior to any of this happened. But we have seen what has happened in the course of this period. We have seen how Parliament has been rendered virtually irrelevant by the government. We have seen how the enforcement has depended on the tip of the policeman's lathi and not so much free and willing consent of most people to follow the rules. We have seen how the government has floundered from one strategy to another, from saying, okay, lockdown will solve everything, to, okay, lockdown probably won't solve everything, to, okay, we don't know what will solve this address and hopefully this problem and hopefully it will go away. So I think it has shown up what is the true capacity of the Indian government. The pessimist in me would say that, this is all building over decades and years and nobody has interest to change it and I don't think anything will happen. The optimist, I think, in me would say that the reform will start at the state levels. States will realize that they were at the forefront of this. They were found wanting. And there are enough political entrepreneurs in this country who will come forward and say, I have found a solution. And that solution looks something like what we need to reform our institutions for. Not to say that the 10th schedule will be gone because states want it. It requires the right set of political circumstances and will to come together, which is hard for me to foresee in the next 5-10 years. But to give you context, I think in 8 months ago, if you had told me that courts across India would be functioning only in the online mode, if courts in India, such as the Gujarat High Court, had been live streaming their proceedings and everything had moved online overnight, I would have simply refused to believe it. I said, That's not going to happen for another 10 years. But what I had imagined would take 10 years happened literally overnight. So maybe, and this is what the optimist in me would say, is that if the right set of political circumstances and the will comes together, it's possible that, and it's an acknowledged problem, believe me, every political party out of power knows that the 10th schedule is terrible. It's just a matter of what they do when they're back in power. So I think it's a question of if we find ourselves in the right political moment for it. As regards reforming the political executive, permanent executive, it's a long, hard task. The 10th schedule, you just relatively just needs a constitutional amendment to pass, and you just need to get enough consent of enough parties. But it is a much bigger task. It's a generational task. Today, if we start an effort to say that this is, just to implement some of the suggestions that I've talked about, it'll take a generation before it becomes a changed bureaucracy. But I think given the time frame of which the book looks at, given the time frame at which we're looking to address India's challenges in 2048 approximately, I think if we start now, we will have an Indian state ready to meet the challenges along the way, and also what the world will look like in 2050. I know people might think that if we just have enough economic growth, we'll solve a lot of problems. I don't think so. Or people might believe that, if we just have more just and equal society, we'll solve all problems. I don't necessarily think so. Those are good things to have in and of themselves. Nobody's saying they're bad things. But to fundamentally ensure that these gains are long lasting, whether in terms of material prosperity or dignity in life, you need to have a governance capability which can ensure that these gains are built on and they're not lost in the context of 1 or 2 generations. So which is where I think, as an optimist, I believe it's possible for these changes to happen. There's nothing fundamentally, they're not fundamentally opposed to the way the Indian society functions or the state functions. And it's an incredibly dynamic society if you want to think about it that way. People may question whether there is an Indian society at all, and that's a different debate. But if we have seen the kinds of challenges that people have faced and how people have met them and how things are changing faster than we can even imagine, I think it's possible. But I would say that it's not going to happen on its own. It is going to be somebody who will have to take the bull by its horns and say, these are the changes we need, and set about making them.
Alok, you talked about taking the bull by the horns. And so before we wrap up, again, I want to ask you, as citizens, is there something that we can do?
It's difficult, but I think the first thing is to sort of have the right expectations from government. I think far too many people, and I would say this to the ordinary citizen, just don't think beyond their immediate level of government. I think people expect, and I have this from a sitting MLA in Bangalore, who sort of pointed out that people don't care if you're an MLA or a corporator. They expect you to pick up the call and answer. In one way, it's good. It holds them honest and accountable. But in another way, it sort of means that their task is more grievance redressal rather than making laws, making reforms and changes. And I think the more that people choose, and whatever, we may have questions about our electoral system, but I think at the end of the day, almost all Indian elections happen in a fairly free and fair environment. I think as citizens, we need to have that expectation of government to function in a democratic manner. I think that is the biggest thing that citizens can do. Of course, there's the element of building awareness and so on, and also about greater engagement with the government. But I would not like this Indian society too much on engagement, because I think we have a very engaged population. It's just that they don't have, a large section of the population not educated enough to be able to make cogent representations of the government. So they will raise demands and they will find that they're not heard, and they will respond in a certain way. So people are engaged. People know and understand what the government is doing or not doing and what they should do. But it's about having the right expectations and the right level of government. I think that is really what we need as citizens to learn, that we just can't we should not be expecting our local MLA to come and fill up our potholes. We should not be expecting our MP to just sign off on some project here and a project there, or spend 2 lakhs on a bus stop or 2 lakhs on a shelter here or there. We should be holding them accountable for how did you, as say, for example, the MP for Bangalore North, which is Bangalore Central, which is a constituency that I'm sitting in currently, how did you ensure that Bangalore Central sort of was represented in Parliament? Did you represent the interests of an urban dwelling Indian living in the south of this country when important bills are coming up for discussion? Did you take up these issues? Did you take up those issues? What is your position on this? What's your position on that? How did you sort of address the concerns of citizens when it came to questions of, infrastructure spending on urban infrastructure, like say the metro? Did you help Bangalore get a metro rail or not? I mean, things like this. We should learn to raise the right questions and not see government as just a service delivery, which is supposed to fill potholes or get an Aadhaar card or something.
Very lucidly put, Alok. And while our book might not delve into what Indian citizens should expect from the government in that level of detail, we do look at the big picture, and we have a lot of chapters just as fascinating as Alok's. And so I highly recommend to all of our listeners that if you've got some free time on your hands, you should pick up a copy of India's Marathon, Reshaping the Post-Pandemic World Order, available on Amazon. Give it a look, give it a read, tell us what you think about chapters. We're always eager to hear from you, and we'll see you in our next podcast. Alok, as always, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for listening to All Things Policy.
My pleasure, Anirudh, and Aditya, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Want to wish you all a happy Diwali. Hope you had a great festive season. It's been a great week in terms of the kinds of guests we've had and the kind of conversations we've had on the network this week. Do definitely check some of these things out. On This Round's on Me with Gauri Devidayal, she had a great conversation with Garima Arora, who's one of the best-known chefs in the world. It was just absolutely riveting. Do check that out. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini Hariharan spoke about chronicling India's different wars. Again, really interesting episode. Check that out. Ashton had a very interesting episode on his show, The Habit Coach. It was called I Don't Feel Like Doing Anything. It's about how to overcome malaise just generally, and I thought really, really interesting stuff. Kumi Vayana was the guest on Cyrus Says on Monday's episode last week, and she's an educator, and my God, it was such a fascinating conversation talking about the way education functions in India and some of the changes she'd like to see. Just really, really interesting stuff. Do give that a listen. On Uncle Please Sit, Anupam Manur was there with Joel and Tushar talking about the Indian economy, part one of a two-part series. Second part will be out this week. You should definitely check that out. Lastly, I want to talk to you all about the Filter Coffee podcast. Karthik Nagarajan, who hosts that show, is on a little bit of a break. He's back with a banger of an episode. It is with Himura Maya, who used to run Landmark Stores, and they talk about the culture of bookstores and quizzing and all kinds of stuff. Really interesting conversation. Do check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms, and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.